All right, welcome. Today's webinar is about emergency notification. My name is Michelle Malski. I'm the Manager of Safety Programs here at the Institute, and I will be your guide during today's presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending our webinar today, and we hope that you enjoy this educational presentation that we have prepared. In case you'd like to watch this presentation again or share it with your team in the future, this presentation will be recorded and we'll make the recording available at the conclusion of today's presentation. The recording will be available at www.shortlinesafety.org. Just click on the Webinars tab and select the webinar that you wish to view. To ensure quality audio for today's presentation, we have placed all of our attendees on mute. You will only be able to hear our presenters speaking. If you have any questions during the presentation, you may use the questions bar located on the right-hand side of the pop-up screen for this webinar. We will dedicate some time at the end of this presentation for a question and answer session. If you have any questions after this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me or our presenter with the contact information that will be listed on the very last slide of this presentation. Now for today's webinar, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Mr. James Dahlem, Transportation Specialist, DOT FRA. Our presenter is here with us now, and so I will turn it over to him to tell us a little bit about himself, his background, and get us kicked off for today's webinar.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Just a quick background on me. I work for the FRA, Office of Safety, at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. I work on emergency notification systems, the grade crossing inventory, and a few other programs at FRA. Prior to this, I was at FHWA, Federal Highway Administration. One of the things I worked on there was the Section 130 program, is the funding program for grade crossing safety. I also worked for Caltrans in San Diego for 5 years, and before that, a private engineering firm in St. Louis, Missouri. So I want to thank again Michelle and the Short Line Safety Institute for setting up this webinar. It's always good to get out and talk to our partners and hear feedback from you all too, and any questions you all have. So we appreciate the opportunity for this presentation for you all. So we'll get into this, the emergency notification system. We'll talk a little bit about the regulatory side. I'm a federal employee, so that's kind of what we start with and talk about that. But I also want to talk at the end about some of the benefits of the ENS and not just make this a regulatory talk. So we'll also have some pictures too of some ENS signs, some that are good, some that aren't working, and go through those too. So to get started, what is the emergency notification system? So this is a definition straight from our regulation. The ENS is a system in place by which a railroad receives, processes, and responds to telephonic reports of unsafe conditions at highway, rail, or pathway grade crossings. So I underlined systems and highlighted that. A lot of people think it means emergency notification sign, but that S stands for system. So we'll talk about the whole system, not just the sign, as we get into the presentation. So the timeline for emergency notification systems, there was a final rule, and in federal talk, a rule means regulation. So there was the regulations on ENS were issued on June 12th, 2012, and they were revised in March of 2013. And then also right now, we are working on a compliance manual for our inspectors in the field, who you all probably work with at times, so they can help and assist with ENS systems. So we're working on that right now. It's under review by our Chief Counsel's Office, which is what that acronym is, RCC. So we hope to have that out to our field staff soon, so they can assist in working with you on ENS systems. So there are some compliance dates for ENS in the regulations. So all these dates have passed. September 1st, 2015, for railroads without any ENS system at all, they had to have an ENS in place. And if railroads had a non-conforming ENS, which means they had an emergency notification system which didn't match the federal requirements or didn't meet them, they had to update those by March 1st of 2014. So those dates are passed. So now every railroad should have an ENS system in place. There are some various compliance dates on the signs. We'll talk about one of those at the end. But people had different, before the regulations standardized the signs, different railroads had different signs out there. And so those compliance dates allowed some of those signs to stay in place a little bit longer before they had to be replaced. And we'll talk again about the one type of sign that's still allowed that doesn't meet the requirements. So who's responsible for the ENS? So the dispatching railroad is the one responsible. So there's two definitions on here. I won't read through them all, but there's a definition for a dispatching railroad. And a dispatching railroad doesn't have to necessarily have a formal dispatcher. It could be someone that, or could be the railroad that provides the authority for the movement of a train through a highway, rail, or a pathway crossing. So again, it doesn't have to be a formal dispatcher in a dispatch center radioing out to a train. It could just be the railroad that has the authority or gives the authority for a train to move through a highway rail crossing. So the dispatching railroad, again, is the one that is responsible for the ENS system. That may not be the owner of the crossing. Sometimes we have some questions on that. So a railroad may own the crossing, but it may be another railroad that provides the dispatching authority for that crossing. And if there's more than one dispatching railroad at a crossing, we get into this a lot of times too, where we have a class 1 and a class 2, or multiple railroads sharing the same line, and they both have dispatching authority over that. One railroad must be designated as the primary dispatching railroad. So when that happens, the two railroads have to come to an agreement and document that, and we'll talk later on about how that documentation works for that. And if there's more than one railroad that maintains the crossing, same thing, the two railroads, or however many railroads there are, need to come to an agreement on who's the primary maintaining railroad, and that will be the one responsible for the actual ENS signs at the crossing. So where is the ENS applicable? So it's at all grade crossings. So it's public crossings, private crossings, and pathway crossings. So pathway crossings are for non-motorized users. So those would be public or private bike trails, bike paths, jogging trails, things like that. So I have a stock photo here. There's not actually an ES sign at this crossing. This is an old stock photo we have, but even this private crossing out in the desert, this would need an ENS sign at it and an ENS system for this crossing. So I mentioned the ENS is a system. That S stands for system. There's 4 components of the ENS system. And again, this is straight from our regulation, so it's a lot of words in this, but I underline the highlights. It's the signs that are in place. It's the method that railroads use to receive calls. It's the actions that railroads take when they do receive calls, and then the record keeping once they do receive calls. So we'll go through each of these. We'll spend quite a bit of time on the signs, and that's where we'll have some picture examples to go through on some signs that, again, conform and don't conform to the requirements. So the signs must contain 3 things. It must contain a toll-free number, and then there's exceptions for class 2 and 3 railroads. So if you're a class 2 or 3 railroad, you do not need a toll-free number. You do not need a 1-800 or 188 number at the on your sign. However, the exception is it must be a number that someone could make a local call from without incurring long-distance charges. So if you just operate within one area code and you don't want to pay for a toll-free number, you can just put a local number on that sign and don't need a toll-free number. If you're a class 1, you do need a toll-free 1-800 or 888 type of number on the sign. The second thing is an explanation of the purpose of the sign. So for emergency or problem, and the language isn't standardized, so it doesn't have to say for emergency or problem, but it has to have a general explanation of what the purpose of the sign is. And then also the US DOT crossing inventory number. So every crossing has to have a crossing inventory number. So that crossing number should go on the sign. And then the sign must be 12 inches by 9 inches. That's the minimum size. It can be larger. It has to be retroreflective so that it can be seen at night. And then the character height, or the size of the letters, must be at least 1 inch high. And so here's a picture of 2 examples of one. So it has to be a white text on a blue background with a white border. There's 2 examples, one on the left and the right. And then that exception there, the DOT crossing number for that one on the right, it can be a white background with black numbers and black letters on that. And a lot of the larger railroads like to print out signs with that white box on it. So they have a bunch of these signs and they can just stamp the crossing number on it and then put them off to the right crossing. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be either option on the left or right. The option on the right, it has the railroad on it. You can or you cannot put the railroad name on it. It doesn't matter. As long as it has the 3 things we mentioned on the previous slide, the reason, the phone number, and the crossing number. And then the signs are located, 1 sign on each approach to the crossing. So if it's just your standard crossing with a road across it, you'd have 2 signs. You'd have 1 on each side of that crossing. Except only 1 sign is required at what we call farm crossings. And there's, again, another pretty long definition. I won't read through it all. But a farm grade crossing, it's a private crossing intended for farm use or agricultural uses. And those only need 1 sign. So you only need 1 side of the crossing needs a sign. You can put 2 if you'd like, but At a farm crossing, only one sign is required. And then also at a yard or a port or a dock area, or private yard area like that, you don't need an individual sign at each crossing within that port or yard area. One sign is needed though at each entrance to the facility instead of at each crossing within that facility. And then signs, a lot of railroads had put signs on the bungalows next to the crossings. So those don't meet the requirements of this section. So a railroad can still put a sign there if they'd like, but it doesn't meet the requirements of this. They'd still need one at the actual crossing next to the roadway. And then one question we get a lot is the sign orientation. So is the sign parallel to the roadway or perpendicular to the roadway? It's not specified in the regulations. So there's a lot of different competing thoughts on that between the railroads. Some want it perpendicular, so you can see it as you're driving up to the crossing, you would see the sign. Others think it should be parallel to the road, so if you're stuck on the crossing, you could see the sign. There's actually no formal requirement on this at that time. However, it needs to meet the four things that are listed in the regulations. It must be conspicuous to the roadway user. It must not obstruct other signs or warning devices. And it must not limit a view of an approaching train from someone on the road. And if it's a sign mounted on a post, it must have breakaway support. So that if somebody runs off the road and hits the sign, the breakaway supports would protect the vehicle occupant. So we'll go through some example photos of signs, some that are compliant and some that have some issues. So this first one here, the sign's okay, meets the requirements. You can see the blue sign to the right of the police vehicle there. As long as that sign is on breakaway supports, that would meet the requirements. So it's conspicuous, it's visible, it's at the approach to the crossing. So here's another photo of a sign. This one, there's some issues here. From this angle right here, you can see the last couple digits, last 3 digits, that phone number are hidden behind the flashing light. So in this one, we'd recommend that sign be moved down a little bit so it's below the flashing lights. But if someone's there, they might not be able to read those last few digits. Maybe they can walk up closer and get to it and see underneath, but it'd be better just to have that sign lowered a little bit so it's not obstructed at all. So here's another example of a sign. Here's one where you can almost barely see it if you have good eyes. In the upper right flashing light there, you can see the little blue sign peeking out from behind it. So that's a situation where a motorist or pedestrian might not even know there's a sign there. They may look for it, not even see it, much less be able to read the number. So again, this is one too where we'd recommend lowering that sign down so it's visible to the roadway user. Here's another one. This one is, those first few were perpendicular to the roadway. This one here is parallel to the roadway, and that piece of metal in front of it is part of the gate arm equipment that is raised up right now. So you can see right here, there's no way that someone could read that phone number. Even if you got underneath that sign and tried to look as best you couldn't read that phone number. So this is a sign right here that's not visible and doesn't really provide any useful information to a roadway user. And here's another even more extreme example. You can see a very similar situation where the gate arm is raised up. You can just see the top of the blue sign peeking out, and if someone's not completely familiar with ENS signs, they may not even recognize that as being one, much less, again, be able to read the numbers on that, the phone number and the crossing number. So again, this is one where this sign, we definitely recommend this sign be moved and put in a location where it's conspicuous or visible to the roadway users. So in the beginning too, I mentioned some exceptions for the sign that didn't meet the requirements, the letter height and what it was saying. All those compliance dates have passed, except for there's one type of sign that can still remain that doesn't meet the requirements. And so if a sign was in place prior to August 13, 2012, it can remain for the rest of its useful life if the sign is greater than or equal to 60 square inches. And the height of the lettering is at least 3/4 of an inch for the crossing number and phone number. And then the height of the lettering is at least 3/8 of an inch for the explanation of the problem. So, for emergency or problem, call such and such. So we'll look at this picture here of this crossing of this sign. So we looked at all those other blue signs. This looks nothing like all the other signs we have out there. So is this sign acceptable? The sign would be acceptable if the sign, I haven't actually measured this one or been out there. I had Illinois send it to me, but if this sign was greater than 60 square inches and then the text for the phone number and the crossing number is at least 3/4 of an inch and the sign purpose text is at least 3/8 of an inch, and it was installed before August 13th, this sign would actually be acceptable right now through the end of its useful life. So if there's any signs that are missing, damaged, or unusable, they must be replaced within 30 days of when that was discovered. And then our ENS signs required for out-of-service track. The signs must be in place unless the crossing is physically closed. So out of service or not running trains doesn't meet the definition of a closed crossing. So the closed crossing, we have the definition there, but it's a location where the rails or the roadway have physically been removed, so there's no longer an intersection of tracks and roadway. So either, again, the rails or the roadway have to physically be removed, so there's no longer an intersection of the rails and roads. So unless that has happened, if the track is just out of service or not being used, the ENS sign is still required. And part of the reason for that is one example may be if you have a timber crossing surface, and maybe one of the wood timbers is sticking up straight and it's a hazard to the roadway user, they have a number to call to report that kind of situation. So even if there's not a danger of a car being stuck and struck by a train, we still have reasons to have the sign out there, as long as there is a physical crossing there. All right, so that was the signs. Next, we'll talk about the method that railroads use, the second part of the system. So railroads must have a live person answering the phone. So if somebody calls a number on the sign, there must be a live person on the other end of that call, except for situations listed here. So if there's speeds of less than 20 miles an hour on that track, then railroads may retrieve messages via an answering machine. So there can be an answering machine set up as long as the speeds are always going to be less than 20 miles an hour on that track. If there's an answering machine used for that, then the railroads must retrieve the messages prior to the beginning of operations each day. So even though you have an answering machine, you still have to check those messages each day before you begin operations. And a railroad that may be like a tourist or a seasonal or an intermittent railroad, maybe it's a type of industry that only, a logging industry that's only one time of the year, or again, a tourist railroad that's only in the summer or the winter or something like that. Again, they can have an answering machine, but the railroads must retrieve the messages each day. So even if it's not a time when the train's being used or the track's being used, they still have to retrieve those messages in the answering machine each day and prior to the beginning of operations. And then once the train is running, if it's a seasonal type of train or an intermittent train and the speeds are greater than 20 miles an hour, then they must have a live person at the end of the call at that time. So if your railroad doesn't want to have somebody answering these calls, there is an option for railroads to use a third-party answering system. In order to do that, the railroad must inform FRA in writing. And if you have any questions on that, again, in my contact information at the end, you can email me and we can send you a letter template to request that in writing. The third party, though, must be able to be reached, just like if you weren't using a third party. So somebody must be live on the end of that call, and the third party must be able to reach the dispatching railroad immediately once they do receive a call. So in the end, you really you still need somebody at the railroad who can answer the call immediately, but that would be from the third party. And if you're using a third party, the third party must provide the railroad the nature of the report of the unsafe condition and the crossing number where the call came from, and then who provided the report, so whether it's law enforcement or an FRA official or a railroad or the general public, and then the date and the time of the report. All right, so that was the method to receive calls. Next, we'll talk about what happens when you do receive a call, the remedial actions a railroad takes. So there's two different real types of reports. The first type of report for warning system malfunctions, for disabled vehicles or block crossings, those are really critical items. So if there's a call for one of those, the dispatching railroad must notify all trains on approach to the crossing so they can be stopped before they get to the crossing. The railroad must notify law enforcement so they can go out to the crossing and maintain safety. And then they must notify the maintaining railroad if there's a separate maintaining railroad from the dispatching railroad. So if they say there's a separate owner at the crossing that's not the dispatching railroad, they must, dispatching railroad who receives the call must notify the maintaining railroad. And then the railroad shall promptly investigate and immediately take remedial actions if necessary. So there's not a specific time that has to be, the remedial actions have to be taken, excuse me, but the regulations say promptly investigate and immediately take remedial action. So really as quick as we can. Excuse me. So the other type of call would be for, say, a warning of obstructed views or other unsafe conditions. So say there's a pothole at the crossing, or we talked about the timber at a timber surface that may be blocking the roadway. So in that case, the dispatching railroad must contact the maintaining railroad in a timely manner. So we don't say immediately, but we say in a timely manner. And also the dispatch report and make timely repairs or corrections if warranted. And then again, if there's multiple dispatching railroads or maintaining railroads at the same crossing, then the primary dispatching railroad needs to provide its emergency and telephone number at the ENS sign. And then after the primary dispatching railroad receives a call, they must contact all of the railroads that dispatch trains through that crossing. And then finally, we'll talk about the last part of the system, the record keeping. This is kind of generic. I won't go through all these. This is just straight from the regulations. So there's a bunch of things that need to be recorded and kept records of. So the type of crossing, the roadway name, the crossing number, the date and time, who the report came from, the actions taken prior to resolving the unsafe conditions, such as warning the trains, contacting the dispatching railroad and law enforcement, and then if the unsafe condition is substantiated and what actions were taken to remedy it, the time and date of the remedy, reasons if no actions were taken, and the time and date maintaining railroads were contacted. So again, we talked about if there's more than one dispatching railroad through a crossing, and one of the railroads is responsible, or more than one railroad is responsible for the maintenance, then the records of the assignment of the primary dispatching railroad and primary maintaining railroad must be kept, and all records must be kept for a minimum of 1 year after the incident. And then another thing I don't have listed here too is that in the regulations, FRA has a right to request those records if they come out and do an inspection. So that was a lot of regulatory talk. The last few slides I want to go through actually does the ENS work and talk about it and some of the history of it. So we'll just look at one incident, May 2nd, 1995. Amtrak struck a tractor trailer in South Carolina. In this incident, the truck was lodged on a humped crossing for 35 minutes and did not notify the police or the railroad. Back then, there was no sign posted at the crossing. That was before railroads were posting ENS signs generally. So that truck was stuck there for 35 minutes and didn't notify anybody before the Amtrak came. So the NTSB went out and did a report, and one of their findings said, had the emergency notification information been posted at the accident crossing, the truck driver may have used it to notify the railroad, thereby avoiding the incident. So this was a situation where we didn't have an ENS. Maybe we could have prevented something. As part of their findings, NTSB also recommended, they recommended this to class ones, but at the time, they recommended 24-hour toll-free emergency notification system, very similar to what we have now. So the NTSB back then recognized it after that incident and recommended it for class ones. NTSB recommendations aren't binding or law, but it is a recommendation for railroads. So the railroads took that to heart. And then recently, following that one in 1997, just 2 years later, there was another Amtrak collision with the truck, and CSX then decided to place emergency notification signs with a 1-800 number at all their crossings on their system. So that was, for their system, that was 24,000 crossings in 20 states at the time. As part of that, CSX also notified trucking companies, law enforcement, fire departments, and even schools, driver's ed classes, and those. So people, the motorists were aware of those signs out there. So if they were stuck or had an unsafe condition, they knew that the sign was there and could make some calls. So within 1 year of putting those signs up, 47 tractor trailer trucks on CSX systems had been reported stuck on the tracks, but the collisions prevented because of that. So I think that's a big success. Just 1 year after they put that system up in the 90s, there's at least 47 incidents with just tractor trailers alone that were prevented. And there was another study in Texas. This was a few years later. It was a 30-month study. It was from 2001 to 2003. And this was statewide for the state of Texas. So they put up a system, and there were over 37,000 calls received over that time, or about 1,200 calls per month of emergency situations at crossings. And it covered 62 of the 69 railways. So almost every railway in their state had some kind of incident that was reported at a crossing and prevented. And the calls also covered almost 5,000 of their crossings within the state. So there was a lot of potential incidents that were prevented as part of that study. And then there was further another study. This was in Pennsylvania. So CEDACOG, it's central Pennsylvania. It's a few counties in Pennsylvania, so it's not nearly as big as the whole state of Texas. But they did a study of some of the a similar type of system in their area. And here are the percentage of the type of calls they received. So they received 75 calls in 1 year. Almost 2/3 of them, a little over 60%, were for signal problems. 8 of them were for vehicles on the tracks, and then you could see some of those smaller numbers there for some of the other incidents. But one of the feedback we had before the regulations required this at all crossings was that railroads were saying, oh, if we put these signs up here and have numbers, we're going to get a bunch of nuisance calls about, people complaining about horns being blown and things like that. But the study with CSX, with Texas, with Pennsylvania, it showed those weren't the case. And we actually had some other pilot studies too that showed the same thing. So you can see on this, we didn't really have any nuisance calls. There was one other. I don't know what that other was. I'm assuming that might have been the one type of call that was for something that wasn't a safety issue. But all these other things were safety issues on that. And then we also have a website here. I know this presentation will be available afterwards for people, so if you don't write this down, you can go back to this and visit this. We have a bunch of information. We have frequently asked questions on there. We also have some resources you can download too to help you out. And that is the end of the presentation. So I guess we'll open up to questions now.
Excellent. Thank you, James. So we'll begin with some question and answers now for this part of the presentation. So if you do have some questions, feel free to use that questions box that is on the right-hand side of your screen. All right, looks like we have quite a few questions here already to get us started. So we will start with the first question here. So James, is it okay to have no ENS signs at a road crossing on out-of-service track where the rails have been paved over, but the track is not physically removed?
Okay, that's a good question. We actually run into this. It's very similar on the inventory too. Like what's a closed crossing? And so if the tracks are paved over, even though the rails haven't physically been removed, usually we consider that to be a closed crossing if the rails have been paved over. So if they're completely paved over and there's no rails visible, in general, that would be a closed crossing. And at that point, there wouldn't be any inventory record. The inventory record would be closed, and then the ENS sign would not be required.
Okay, great. Move on to the next question. What is the railroad's responsibility for ENS signs on industry tracks not owned by the railroad?
All right, so to make sure I understand this question correctly, the ENS is required of the dispatching railroad. So if you're a railroad that dispatches over industry tracks, then you would be responsible for the ENS system. The actual signs would be the responsibility of the maintaining railroad. So if the industry owns the tracks and maintains those tracks, they would be responsible for the physical signs, but the actual phone number and systems would be the responsibility of the dispatching railroad. So again, if you dispatch, the owner of those would be the maintaining railroad. They'd be responsible for the sign, unless for some reason you have an agreement that you maintain those tracks in that crossing. But the one that owns and maintains the crossing are generally the ones that puts up the signs.
Excellent, thank you. All right, the next question we have here is, what is the railroad's responsibility for ENS signs on industry track crossings where the railroad does not operate over that crossing? Kind of similar to what you just mentioned there. Yeah, so again, if the question isn't answered correctly, feel free to type in again the question. So this one, it sounds like what you're asking is the railroad doesn't operate over, it's just an industry. It's not an actual railroad, and no actual railroad operates over that. So an industry within a private area does not meet the definition of an operating railroad, so they would not be responsible for any ENS signs at all. So if it's a private industry within a private area, like their own yard, maybe it's a chemical plant, or within a military base and the military is running it. If it's a private industry within a private area, there's no ENS requirement. Once it's out on the general system railroad, then it would be, again, the dispatching railroad, whoever's dispatching the trains over that crossing would be responsible for the ENS system, and then the signs would be the responsibility of the maintaining railroad. Okay. Which railroad is responsible for ENS system or signs on industry track road crossings where multiple different railroads serve and operate within that facility? Okay, another good question. So this was the situation we mentioned where they, if there's more than one dispatching railroad,
then the dispatching railroads must assign a primary dispatching railroad to be the one responsible for the ENS system. So that would be their phone number that would go on the sign. And then if they receive a call, they must notify all the dispatching railroads. If there's only one dispatching railroad for all the railroads that operate over it, then that would be the one. But if there's multiple railroads and they all have dispatching authority over that, then the dispatching railroads need to assign one to be the primary dispatching railroad, and then just document that internally within your records and keep that record. But it would have to be assigned, the railroads have to come to an agreement on who's the primary dispatching railroad.
Great. All right. We're coming to our last question, it looks like right here. Question is, are the new ENS sizes smaller than the original required signs originally, and what is the acceptable size now?
Okay. Yeah, so the sign size haven't changed, and I can try and flip back to the thing. I can go back to the sign size. There's one type of sign previously that was, first we'll go back to the first requirements of the sign. 12 inches by 9 inches is the size of the sign, and 1 inch minimum character height. So that's the new requirements for any new sign that gets installed. If there's an existing sign, we'll have a picture of one too. So we'll show the text here. If there's a sign installed prior to August 13th, 2012, the sign can remain in place for its useful life if the size of the sign is greater than 60 square inches, and then the height of the lettering is 3/4 of an inch minimum for the crossing number and the phone number, and then 3/8 of an inch for the explanation of the purpose of the sign. And so we showed this picture here. This sign would be acceptable if, again, I haven't physically measured this sign, but if this sign was at least 60 square inches, and then the text height was 3/4 of an inch for the phone number and the crossing number, and 3/8 of an inch for the explanation of the sign at the top, that first part, that sign would still be acceptable. Any new signs that are installed have to meet the requirements that are listed before, the 12 inch by 9 inch and the 1 inch text height.
All right, we got just a couple more here that filtered in. Okay, so the next question we have here is, if there are multiple tracks in an area, would you need an ENS sign for each track?
All right, that's another good question. So the way we define a crossing is it's one crossing if there's one set of warning devices. So if there's two tracks and there's only one set of warning devices for it, then there's just one crossing, one DOT crossing number and one ENS sign on each approach, but only one ENS sign. If there's two tracks and they're separated far enough that there's two sets of warning devices, then you would need two different ENS signs, and there'd be two different crossing numbers for that. So there's no physical distance requirement. It's whether or not there's one set of warning devices for that crossing of multiple tracks.
Excellent. All right, so our last question here for today is, give us a second here, we're just reading through it.
Yeah, we'll just read out loud. Let's go through. I have been advised that industry roadways within a plant have to have an ENS sign, and can be accomplished in two ways. First, one ENS number is assigned to cover all roadways inside the mill, but each crossing needs to be numbered for reference. And second, can you identify each crossing with an ENS number? Is it up to the railroad for that decision? So within when you say inside of a mill, so that'd be like a private yard area. The way the inventory regulations work is that only one crossing number is required within a private yard or a private industry or a private port or private dock area. So as long as it's a private area with no access, then all the crossings within that would just have one DOT number. A railroad, it's up to the railroad. They can assign a different DOT number for every crossing within those private areas, but in general, most railroads, even in the biggest yards with tens of roadway crossings across them, will just assign one number to it. That's the way it's generally done. So there's just one DOT crossing number for that industry or that yard area or that mill area. And then on each roadway approach to that, there would need to be a ENS sign. But within the actual facility, there doesn't need to be any ENS signs at those crossings, just on each roadway approach to the private facility.
All right, we had one more question filter in there at the end, and it said, no orientation preference at this time. Any indication of possible future requirement?
All right, I was waiting for that question. That's always a hot topic. As of right now, it doesn't look like we're going to have any future requirement for that. We're going to stick with what we have, both parallel and perpendicular to the roadway. As long as it meets the requirements, it's conspicuous. It doesn't block the side of any train coming. It doesn't block any other signs or lights, and so forth. So as of right now, there's no indication of any, or no, we're not moving toward requiring one orientation or the other.
Great. All right. And that will conclude us today for our question and answer session. Our last slide is presented here on our screen, and that is the contact information for our presenter. So if you do have any follow-up questions or would like to talk to James privately, there is his email as well as his phone number. And if you have any future suggestions, want to hear about a certain topic, or have any comments for me about the webinar program or this webinar provided today, please feel free to give me a call or an email, which is also provided here. So that really wraps us up for today. I thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our presenter for joining us here today. We hope you have a safe day and week, and we look forward to our next webinar and that you will join us. All right, thank you very much, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Make it a safe day. Thanks, everyone.